Hello, everyone. Good morning. You can hear me okay? Excellent. Today I will speak briefly around anywhere, anyone, anytime, anyone, transitioning towards 21st century learning, as very much articulated this morning. A little bit about me. This is me. This is my about.me page. I'm an extensive user of social media, a connected educator, I would call myself. This is the same sort of page that I have my students develop. Often the students I get who become teachers eventually have spent time on social media as high school students, and some of these spaces that they take up into university may have been a bit embarrassing. So this is a way of actually consolidating and taking account of the places that they've been and developing a professional account, which I'll talk about in a second. I spend a lot of time in my role working with graduate and undergraduate students, helping them develop digital profiles that they will be able to also develop and spend time with their students to role model for themselves. And I also learn plenty from my 4 children who are at very different stages of using social media as they grow up. So this is a bit of what grounds me, I guess, and the kind of work that I do in working in a faculty of education. So I want to speak first about shifts in EdTech, and I've spent a career looking at different forms of educational technology and spending time with it. I remember working with HyperStudio and HyperCard in my early days, and of course now it's very different. We look at things like Snapchat in education. So my personal memories, thinking back, I think it's really important to look at the Douglas Adams quote. If you remember, when we think about technology, what we actually take into account and what we actually count as technology. Douglas Adams is famous for saying, technology is anything that in the world when you're born is normal and ordinary and just natural part of the way the world works. It's also anything that's invented between the time you're 15 and 35, and it's new and exciting and revolutionary, and you can probably get a career in it. That's how we view technology. Anything invented after the time you're 35 is against the natural order of things. So, and I think that's really an important way of looking at technology, is sometimes we find this new technology to be unnatural in many ways. So for me, the Apple IIc, this is the place I started. This is the place I fell in love with computing and coding. I remember buying magazines at the time, things like Nibble and Compute, for instance, spending a lot of time actually just typing in code and learning how to become a bit of a programmer back in the day. As time went on, I remember going into the classroom using tools like Number Muncher, and I don't know if this is something that's familiar to you or not. A lot of drill and practice games we used to spend time on. And this really hasn't changed a whole lot. Much of even the modern LMS, when you look at learning management systems, are originated from the drill and practice type games from the 1970s and 1980s. But when we start to think about technology today and how much it's shifted, we can take a quick look at Snapchat, for instance. So, for instance, if Snapchat were developed today, it might look something, or were developed in the 90s, it might look something like this.
Welcome to another episode of Wonders of the World Wide Web, your map to surf the web. In this episode, we're going to talk about Snapchat. Do you have a PC with Windows, a handheld image scanner or CD-ROM reader, a modem, and a diskette with the Snapchat upload software? Then you can use Snapchat, digital online image sharing software. We're going to use Snapchat in 12 easy steps. But before we start, we need photos. But how does it work? Computers may be able to read diskettes, but they definitely can't read photographic films. Let's start with step 1.
Step 1.
We're going to digitize our photos. For this, we use a handheld scanner. A handheld scanner is a device that scans a picture and sends it to your computer in digital code. Isn't that amazing? And if you don't have a scanner, develop your photos on a photo disk.
Step 2.
Make a connection to the internet. Be sure that nobody in the house needs to make a phone call because uploading may take a while.
Step 3.
Now we have our photos. We're going to upload them. We do this by using the Snapchat upload software. Start the software called Snapchat.
Step 4.
I'm not going to show the entire thing, but it's interesting to see how, if we juxtapose the technology that we grew up with to technology today, how much easier and how much different it might be today. But it also brings together a particular way of looking at pedagogy. So much of what we've done in the past has been really around the pedagogy of isolation, that for the most part, technology has been used to allow us to independently advance in our own knowledge and skills, and not really paying much attention to those who are around us in the classroom or even globally. So if we look at back in the 19th century, there was French artists who actually had all sorts of different explanations of how learning in the future might actually look. This idea of actually just pouring information into our heads. And it wasn't a whole lot different even looking at this 1925 invention. This is called the isolator. And the whole idea behind this invention was to basically isolate you from all outside external influences of any possible way. In fact, the isolator was designed to help focus the mind when reading or writing, not only by eliminating all outside noises, but by also allowing just one line of text to be seen at a time through a small slit. So you could only see a certain amount of information at a time. And when we think about this is actually an image from a Philippines classroom where basically the whole idea of this, people having to cheat and actually to participate or collaborate with one another was something that was certainly outlawed. But this is really meant for cheating in this particular case. But it's not a whole lot different when I think about the way that we often use technology in many classroom settings, that although we may have very technology-rich classrooms, we may not actually use them in any way to share or collaborate or actually talk to one another in a social setting. So we've seen in the last few years this idea of reemergence of social learning. Now, social learning has been around for a very long time, but I feel for the very first time the technology is starting to catch up with the pedagogy or the pedagogical innovation that's available. So we know that there's a number of different tools. These are just a small example of some of the tools that I use in my graduate and undergraduate courses. But beyond this, in thinking about the greater shifts, some years ago there was a post by Timu Leonin, and where he put the idea of the critical history of ICT. So in the 1970s, we saw programming, drill and practice, and we've kind of moved slowly over to this idea of open source and social movements. Now, if we align this with pedagogy, we see this idea of individual growth to group growth. And if we look at actual pedagogical strategies or psychological ways of looking at learning, we've moved from behaviorist to cognitivist to constructivist to social learning type practices. And I'll explain this a bit more. John Seeley Brown, in an article called Minds on Fire, about 2008, wrote that we've for once seen the Cartesian view of learning as knowledge as substance and pedagogy as knowledge transfer, the idea that we just have information to strictly transfer from one head to the other, to a social view of learning. We participate, therefore we are, and seeing understanding as socially constructed. And this is the premise for the rest of the presentation, really, is thinking differently about the way that we actually start to think about learning in our classroom. And this comes from other sort of pop research, or this is actually research from the 1960s from Granovetter, the famous sociologist who talked about the strength of weak ties. Essentially, it boiled down to the idea that there is strength in weak ties. Our acquaintances, not our friends, are potentially our greatest sources of new information and ideas. And this idea is really important. This is where you start to see social networks really emerge, that we don't necessarily have to have strong connections to those that we spend a lot of time learning from. This is, in many ways, the way that we use Twitter, for instance, or other social networks. Or from Johnson, where good ideas come from Stephen Johnson. One of the ideas in this book was basically the idea that we've spent a lot of time hoarding knowledge. That we used to think that learning in many ways was this idea of actually keeping knowledge to ourselves and coming up with good ideas, where they say, where in Johnson's book, the trick to having good ideas is not to sit around in glorious isolation and try to think big thoughts. The trick is to get more parts on the table. That we should actually openly share the knowledge that we accumulate, that we blog it, that we tweet it, whatever we might do to actually allow more information for others to come up with innovation at the same time. So, as Darcy Norman probably says it in a very simple way, when you surround yourself by smart people, whether it's by social network or whether it's in front of you, this sort of magic will happen. And I think this is really an important piece for ideas and innovation sharing. Now, for the longest time, we saw there's been a lot of metaphors for this new way of actually looking at social learning. I remember some years ago, there was a famous composer by the name of Eric Whitacre who basically did something what was really interesting at the time. He went out there, he basically composed to the internet, uploaded this video to YouTube, and people from around the world decided to sing to him. And so what he was able to do was take this video and have all of these different people sing to him. He pieced it all together and he created this incredible virtual choir, which for many people was this new way of actually looking at learning in a way that we had never seen before. Other sorts of influences that we saw were the number of different people on the internet who were able to create innovation from nowhere. One of the most famous was a guy by the name of Zay Frank. And I don't know if you followed a show, it was called The Show in 2006, where he was probably one of the first vloggers or video bloggers, Zay Frank, and he put all sorts of interesting challenges out to the internet. One was simply young me, now me, and it had people basically take a photograph of themselves from the past and basically ask them to recreate it in the future. Here's one good example of it. Other good examples, a couple that met each other apparently when they were young kids, messy eaters, all sorts of interesting ideas like that, or a couple of brothers who had baths when they were young. But just this sort of thing, he did all sorts of really interesting challenges that got people motivated to share things online, and it actually affected a lot of people. There's other really interesting examples of this out there. There was one project called Dear Photograph, where it was basically a project to allow people to take a photograph of the past, or to take a photograph of the past and to overlay a photograph from the present on top of that. And there was all sorts of really interesting ones that I was able to see over the years, and this will hopefully make sense in a bit here. But I love this particular one where you can sense what's happening in here, and in just a very clean image. This man looking down to a picnic bench and seeing what he once had. And I saw this tweeted by a guy by the name of Jonathan Stamp on Twitter. And I basically asked, can I borrow your Dear Photograph piece in a keynote presentation I'm giving in the UK? He says, feel free. The paper photo was taken about 15 years ago. So he was battling cancer with grace. Today he is still in love. And it was this new idea that we're also not just sharing ideas online, but we're also sharing these really intimate moments. And this is one of the big changes, I think, that we saw in terms of the way that we look at learning and sharing and collaboration online. So the other big change, and I think this is one of the most important pieces, is that we moved, as Martin Weller calls it, pedagogy of abundance. We have so much content available to us that it really starts to shift things in classrooms. So we know in 1999, MIT decided to give all of their content away for free. And this marked a change, not only to an open source movement, but also starting to begin the origin of massive open online courses. But of course, I would say that one of the biggest massive open online courses in the world really is YouTube, as a much larger idea. YouTube is where you see people learn all sorts of things across the world. And this has been going on for some time. Now, some of those things may not be the things you want to learn. When I type in how to learn to in YouTube, it says how to learn how to play guitar for beginners, how to learn how to sing, how to dance, how to do the splits in one day, which I don't think is probably the best thing you should learn. How to sing, how to fight. A lot of them are more skills-oriented examples, but there are people around the world that will learn things. What's also interesting is the type of content's available is also competing with the type of content that we have in our classes. One of my favorite examples of a high-quality podcast, YouTube or a YouTube channel, is this one called Smarter Every Day. One of my favorite episodes is this particular one, and it's a guy by the name of Dustin. who basically creates these YouTube challenges that they're very inquiry-based. So you can see what he's done here. He's actually taken a bicycle and he's rigged it so that if you will turn your bike right, it'll turn the bike left, and if you turn the left, it'll turn the bike right. And so he spends about 9 months trying to ride a bicycle like this, which I think is a great challenge for someone. And it takes him the entire 9 months to do it. And you can see him trying in the early days, trying to work it out here. Now, of course, his son was able to figure this out in about 3 weeks. He was actually able to figure it out in a very short time versus Destin here, who wasn't able to get it. But what's great about videos, and videos like this and this video, they're very relational. When you start to look at this example, he tells a story of knowledge. He tells a story that actually gets you into things like neuroplasticity, that gets you into knowing versus understanding. A lot of really deep, both philosophical and scientific understanding in this short video. It's quite storied. He tells it in a storied approach. As you can see here, he kind of shares his story with others. It's inquiry-based. It's not just simply facts, and it's very accessible. You can watch this as a young person, or you can watch this as a scientist, and you get something from it in many ways. And this is the type of thing that we're seeing constantly, and young people are exposed to, and they're expecting this sort of thing in the classes that they take. So we get to this point where everything I learned in college can be found for free on the internet, and this is a bit of a problem for professors like me and others in the room who basically stake their lives and their livelihoods on the ability to teach new things or teach in new ways. So to react to this, and I think to get a better sense of what's possible here, is to move towards more open and connected pedagogy. And I'll explain what that means in a bit here. So first of all, developing open and connected literacies is probably one of the first things that we really have to start getting a better sense of as instructors, as educators. Howard Rheingold from Stanford once said, understanding how networks work is one of the most important literacies of the 21st century. So the other idea of actually understanding how to not only to use networks, to use them to send messages, but also to learn from them in many ways. Similar to what you've seen already, the idea of 10 skills for the future workspace, you'll notice some of the most prominent ones, things like social intelligence. Of course, this also means across the world, new media literacy, developing and understanding new ways of media, and virtual collaboration, which you continue to see, this idea that we must be better at learning online. The National Council for Teachers of English developed this some years ago, and this is really important. Things like build relationships with others to pose and solve problems collaboratively and cross-culturally is a strong one. Design and share information for global communities to meet a variety of purposes. And this is probably one of the most prominent ones I use in my classrooms, this idea of actually designing information that can be shared beyond the classroom. And manage, analyze, and synthesize multiple streams of simultaneous information. This idea of moving beyond cognitive overload and actually being able to make sense or sense make in this greater information expanse. So when I was doing my dissertation some years ago, I looked at very typical teacher networks. So this idea of what we had access to as educators. So curriculum documents, colleagues, popular media, printed and digital resources. But we've seen this expand very quickly to all sorts of different things in this idea of the network teacher. So moving beyond this, thinking of all the different channels that we might find for information. But beyond this, and what's really most important, what I learned many years later, it's less about the conduit. It's less about the tool that we might use. Whether it's Twitter or Plurk or something that you've used in the past, these things come and go, but ultimately these relationships are the things that must continue well beyond. They must linger beyond the tools. So whether it's Twitter or whatever tool it might be, to have some literacy within those tools to basically form and connect and maintain and sustain relationships, but even being able to find information in different ways is becoming increasingly important. So this is an example of an 8th grader, one of my favorite examples of learning on the internet, an 8th grader who wanted to learn how to start fire with what's called a bow drill. And rather than actually just Google it at the time, he decided to ask the question on YouTube and get it seen by enough people so that he could find the proper answer. And here's his response here.
Hello, I'm trying my hardest here to make a bow drill set. See this is my spindle, and this is my block that you put on the top. So when you're spinning it around like that, so it won't melt into your hand. And then this is the bow that I use, and I just use some paracord, nylon paracord. And then this is the hearth that's made out of yellow cedar. The hole is right there, and I tried another hole, but that was too deep, so it didn't really work. And then this is the tinder, just normal dry lint. And I'm going to show you how I do it. And I'm doing it wrong, I know I am. And please comment down below so you can teach me how to do it, okay?
So what I love about this video is it was very obscure, was able to get about 15,000 views, which I think was amazing. And in the comments, rather than the horrible comments that we might see on a YouTube video, he actually got quite good ones. Like the very first one, I'm sitting here with my 4 friends and we all bow drill, which I think is kind of an amazing feat because I know no one else in the world who bow drills. But this person was able to find 4 people, a perfect illustration of the long tail as you might know it. And beyond this, and I think what's interesting, University of Toronto professor Barry Wellman, and he really poses a really important idea. He says, the developed world is in the midst of a paradigm shift in both in the ways in which people and institutions are connected. It is a shift from being bound up in homogeneous little boxes to surfing life through diffuse, variegated social networks. And he gives them this illustration of this, thinking about your classroom, for instance, this idea of little boxes really connected and bound within these tight structures, to this idea of globalization where a teacher might actually share and connect their teachers to a much larger, broader social network, but in a safe way. To this idea of, and this ultimate goal of networked individualism, moving towards this idea where each student is independent and self-directed, that they may be able to work fluently within these social networks. Beyond this, and I think this is one of the most important things, as we start to move students into these social spaces, we have to really focus on developing their positive digital identities. As we see more and more, this is from the Toronto Star, forget the resume, online profiles are the tool for young job seekers. And we see this from a number of different news sources continually, this idea that your online profile is becoming more important than your resume, for instance. And we know that many people can make one mistake, one tweet might actually set them on a course for a very bad reputation. And these are very hard to recover in many ways. And we have to think that this idea, a single post, can really define our lives. And this could be a very good thing or a very bad thing. So other examples. This is the University of Mary Washington. You may or may not have heard of this project. But basically, when you come to this university, they give you an online domain. So you actually are able to get your own domain name, which I think is a really important project to actually, rather than rent a space on the web, to actually invest in the web in many ways. For my own students, what I really focus them on is for every student also to get a domain and a WordPress portfolio. So this is an example of one of my students who bought kenralear.ca. And so if I want to find her online, I can find it very quickly. And of course, if I follow her Twitter account, it's one that I can find as well. And this is one of the most important goals in the classes that I personally teach. Beyond that, and I think this is really important for the health of the web in general, but also the health of our students, to think about how we can actually address positive online discourse. We know that there's many places on the web that are very negative. One of my favorite quotes on this, Lev Grossman says, "Some of the comments on YouTube make you weep for the future of humanity just for the spelling alone, never mind the obscenity and the naked hatred." So how do we actually create something that's more positive out there that we can actually help students thrive within? So this is an example. This is a worksheet for young elementary students. Basically, it's the idea of you have this worksheet, you can suggest tweets, and you can allow these tweets to be vetted by the classroom of other students, and they can ask particular questions whether this is something that's tweet-worthy. I know one president who could probably use it, something like this. I won't mention any names. Or even this particular example of a really great comment. What does it mean to be a good commenter? And this is one of the biggest skills that I focus on. Less about writing blog posts, but how do you actually comment well? How do you comment well on political articles? How do you comment well on blog posts? How do you comment well in general on the web? And this is really an important skill. Designing for open and connected learning. John Seeley Brown and Douglas Thomas wrote a book called A New Culture of Learning, and they basically describe the internet as one place where there's this vast expanse of knowledge. But for us as educators to actually develop this bounded and structured environment that we can work within this particular environment, and this is becoming more and more important, is studying the relationship between what we do in classrooms and this vast expanse of the internet. So the classes I teach are sort of in between a traditional course and a MOOC. So my students still have private spaces that we spend time in, but there's also public spaces that we spend a lot of time with for the rest of the web. And I spend a process with all of my students to basically thin the walls. So this idea that it's really important for us to have private and closed spaces, but it's also important within our educational profile to have experience in public and open spaces. And over time, you sort of move over into these spaces and you become more comfortable with them. Just moving along here, I'm just going to move past this one. This idea of small tools loosely joined. I know many people continue to use learning management systems, and they can be very powerful, and I'm not saying in any way that you shouldn't be using them, but we're also seeing other people who will use a learning management system or just specifically social tools to develop some sort of course learning environment. If we look at the example, for instance, this is from John Mott and David Wiley. They talk about this idea of the course management system, or a learning management system, as some would know. That we often basically try to develop community over a 4-month period or over a semester, and then we destroy the community and then basically try the same thing over again. And this is this idea of building up personal learning networks. We should also at the same time start to think about how we actually develop networks that will outlive the classes. As an example, in my classes here, we will spend time in our private session as in a Google Plus community. But we'll also have, every one of my students will have a WordPress blog for where they'll actually share their ideas. We also have a blog hub. So I actually take every one of their student blogs and I will buy a domain name, and everything will be aggregated at one particular space for students to see it, but it's also in the public. We'll also have a Twitter hashtag, for example, and a number of other tools that we might use throughout the semester that are both private and public, that are sometimes student-controlled and sometimes instructor-controlled. And over time, it's really interesting to see what this actually means. Students will actually perform differently in different spaces. They'll ask more difficult questions, for instance, in places that are more private, and they'll perform differently in other places. Trust is developed each differently in these particular spaces. Students will certainly form stronger bonds with their classmates, but they may not, in some ways, form those same bonds with, of course, internet strangers, which I think is a good thing. And of course, some communities last and are sustainable for a long time, and some aren't. And there's also a depth and complexity to the discourse and collaboration that's involved in different spaces. But for students to understand this and to understand the value of both private and public spaces is becoming an essential skill in many ways. Now, just to move on, and I think this idea of focusing on community is probably one of the most important things. And it's one of the things, again, this whole thread, this idea of moving away from individual-based practices to the idea of moving to focusing on community is becoming more and more important. In 2013, I ran a MOOC. In 2012, I actually tweeted this. So I'm thinking about running an EdTech MOOC starting January. Anyone interested? 12,000 people showed up, which was really kind of a problem to have as an educator. I had to try to figure out, rather than teaching my regular 30 people in a class or 50 people in a class, I had to think about how do I design pedagogy for 12,000 people. One of the first things I did was, I thought we really need to do something to show people that we can do something collaboratively and collectively as a group. So we actually designed, I put out a challenge to design a lip dub. So we, as a community, decided to pick a song. From the song, we decided to actually send videos. And so we were able to develop this lip dub, and I'll show you really quickly what this looks like. So we chose a song. It was a Queen song. Here's my brother here for a second, but I'll just pass by this. You got to get the idea, but it's really amazing to see, the superimposition of Red Deer, Canada, to Uruguay, to Vancouver, to Red Deer, to different parts of Canada. What was amazing about this is because of things like this in the course, people really started to form strong bonds with one another. In fact, the course only lasted 10 weeks, but it's still going. Like I left it, and 3.5 years later, now it still runs. In fact, the students invited me to this 3-year anniversary just recently, and I was kind of freaked out because we came into Zoom, and I noticed the president of my university happened to be there. So I thought, oh, I think I'm in trouble or something. But instead, my students all collectively got together, and because my father had passed away during the beginning of the course, they actually created a bursary in the name of my father for students to enter the Faculty of Education who happen to be new Canadians in the program. So looking at things like this, it showed how strong a community can possibly be, even something like a MOOC, for instance. And I'll just kind of pass it on to the last one. And I think, just to finish off here, designing for open and connected learning is becoming one of the most important parts of certainly what I've done, and I'm certainly seeing this as a theme for others as well. And in particular, one of the things I want to focus on is the idea of learning how to learn and how to express your learning online. Seymour Paport, who died within this last year, he said, "The scandal of education is that every time you teach something to deprive a child of the pleasure and benefit of discovery." The way I approach my classes is I'm much more of a guide, I guess, in many ways, a connector for anyone. I help them through media literacy, I help them through social networks, and I help them to find knowledge. One of the things, I'll just focus on this. One of probably the proudest assignments that I have in my classes is something called the Learning Project. And the Learning Project, what students do is they can take anything that they've always wanted to learn, but never had the chance to in formal education to learn about, and they basically blog about it. So they find different internet sources and they learn things. So this is one of my students learning the ukulele. This is one learning Japanese using apps and other things that they may have learned. This is a student who actually learned how to paint using videos of people like Bob Ross, for instance. And this is an example of how they might represent their learning in my class. And that's just an example of a stop motion video to demonstrate that. Now, what we found in the Learning Project, and just to finish off here, is that as my students start to develop and push their learning online, there's this chance for serendipity, that more and more people get involved in their learning. In many cases, these are strangers, sometimes people from their own community. So one of my colleagues, another professor who does this with me by the name of Dean Sharesky, he said, if I'm going to get my students to learn things online and share these things online, I'm also going to do it myself. So he decided to learn a guitar online. And what was amazing was he was in a small town in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. And what he was able to do is someone from Connecticut noticed that he was actually, and he was a teacher from Connecticut who noticed that he was sharing his learning online. And he thought, this guy needs some help. I wonder if I can get my students, who were grade 12 students who were taking music, and each one of these students started to create videos for Dean Sharesky. They would create videos like, Dean, like for instance, Austin created a video that said, Dean, I noticed that you can't keep a beat, so here's a video that explains how you keep a beat. But it was amazing to see that students from different classrooms started helping people learn online. It was just a beautiful shift in pedagogy when you start actually look at it. So to conclude, ultimately, and I won't be able to show the final video here, but what I think is really important, and this is an example of how important, I guess, net connections have been to me. As I mentioned, my father passed away in 2013. 2013. What was one of the most important and powerful technologies is just something like FaceTime. And connecting online was one of those things that I realized was so important back then, and I continue to see how important that is, that my 3 kids at the time could connect to my father. Clay Shirky at one point said, we systematically overestimate the value of access to information and underestimate the value of access to people. And I think this is one of the things that we have to start to think about, is how do we start to really reconnect and think about social learning in a much deeper way. So thank you very much.